Chapter 15. Wolf Wind slipped through the narrow opening in the breakwater that protected Al-Shabaar harbour. She was under oars, and the sail had been gathered and furled to the yard arm. At the peak of the mast flew Evelyn's pennant, 4 meters long, undulating slowly in the offshore breeze to display a red hawk on a white field. Even if the red hawk device itself were not recognised, the extreme length of the pennant and its shape, broad where the hawk device was shown, then narrowing rapidly until it split into 2 swallowtails a metre from its end, were enough to indicate that the ship was carrying a royal delegation, an ambassador at least, or perhaps even a member of a royal family. Svengel had ordered the pennant unfurled when they were still a kilometre offshore, making it clear that his ship had no warlike intent. In spite of that fact, the crews of the dozen or so merchant ships that were anchored in the harbour or tied up to the docks had armed themselves and stood ready along their bulwarks to repel any attempted attack by the Scandians. Sailors in this part of the world, and most others for that matter, knew the Scandian reputation all too well. The presence of a royal standard did little to allay their suspicions. Wolf Wind, lean, narrow, and deadly-looking, slipped past the first of the anchored ships, for all the world like a wolf slinking among a flock of fat, nervous sheep. "Looks like we have a reception committee," Holt said, indicating the main wharf that ran along the inland side of the harbour. There they could see a body of men drawn up, perhaps 50 in all, and from time to time the sun glinted off burnished armour or weapons. A green banner was waving from the pier, the international signal that they were cleared to come alongside. Svengel leaned on the tiller and the bow swung towards the inner harbour. The bow oarsman called the stroke and the wolf ship moved smoothly up the harbour. "I'd better get my reception clothes on," Evelyn said. She slipped below into the small triangular cabin at the stern of the ship. There was barely headroom for her to stand erect there, but at least she had a little privacy. A few minutes later she re-emerged. She had replaced her usual leather tunic with a longer one of dull red satin, which came almost to her knees. It was beautifully embroidered and carried a small red hawk device on the left breast. A broad leather belt gathered the red tunic at the waist. Will noticed idly that the belt was decorated with what seemed to be interwoven leather thongs, threaded in and out through slits in the belt itself, and crisscrossing for its entire length. The long boots and hose remained, as did the white silk shirt she wore under the tunic. On her blonde hair, hastily brushed and gathered, she wore a red, narrow-brimmed hat with a long bill. A single hawk's feather was set in the hatband. She wore a necklace Will had never seen before. It was made of dull grey stones, all the same size. They didn't look to be expensive or even semi-precious stones. More like smooth marble, in fact. He assumed it was just a favourite piece of costume jewellery. Maybe she wore it for luck. Evelyn tugged the tunic straight, removing a few last wrinkles where the belt had cinched it too tightly. She cleared her throat nervously. "How do I look?" she asked Holt. He nodded approval. "Just the right blend of practicality and formality," he replied. She flashed a quick grin at him. She was nervous, Holt saw. "Svengel and I will do the talking for the time being. These will just be minor officials, the harbour master and so forth," he said. "Your turn will come when we meet with the Wakir. For the time being, look arrogant and condescending." She started to smile, realized that such an expression didn't fit his instructions, and instead arched her eyebrows and raised her chin, tilting her head back imperiously so she could stare down her nose at him. "How's that?" she asked. She thought she saw the faintest trace of a grin in the shadows under his cowl. "That's perfect. You could have been born to it." "Don't make me smile, or I'll have you flogged," she said quietly. Holt nodded. "You could be catching on too fast," he said. Then his attention was drawn to the business of docking the ship. Svengal was a flamboyant ship handler, and he brought her in fast. At the last moment he growled an order, and the oarsman backed water fiercely, taking most of the way off her. "Oars!" he called, and the dripping blades rose out of the water, coming vertical before the oarsmen laid them down in their brackets. There was the usual clatter of oak on oak. The ship coasted in for a few more meters. They were at an angle of about 30 degrees to the dock, and one of the crew threw a line from the bow. An Aridi dock worker quickly grabbed it, wound it once round a bollard, and began to haul in. A few seconds later, another rope soared over the water from the stern. This too was seized, and the men on shore began to haul the wolf ship alongside. The crew threw felt and wicker fenders over the side to protect the ship's scantlings from the hard stone of the wharf. As the ropes were made tight fore and aft, Wolfwind rocked gently alongside the jetty, the fenders groaning and creaking slightly as she did so. The railing of the ship was a metre or so below the level of the wharf. Evelyn started towards it, but Holt's low voice stopped her. "Stay where you are. Look imperious. We have to be invited ashore first." The armed men they had seen from further out were ranged along the wharf now in 2 ranks, facing the wolf ship. They all had their shields slung ready for action, and their hands hovered close by the hilts of their swords. An officer detached himself from the line and strode towards the wharf's edge. Svengal recognized him. "This is the bantam rooster who ambushed us in the town square," he said, in what he thought was a whisper. Holt glanced at Svengal sardonically. "I'm sure he's thrilled to hear you say so," he replied. The tall Aridi warrior stopped now, a few paces back from the edge of the wharf. Holt studied him keenly and came to the rapid conclusion that this was a man to be reckoned with. There was an air of assurance about him. Holt sensed that this was not a man to bluster or bluff. He knew what he was doing, and he exuded a quiet confidence. He would bear watching, the ranger thought. The Aridi gave them the traditional desert greeting, touching his right hand to his lips, then his forehead, then his lips again. The gesture was born from the old tribal saying on first meeting, Holt knew. "We will eat, we will consider, we will talk." The correct protocol was to return the gesture, but Svengal didn't know that. He waved his hand vaguely in the air in a clumsy parody of the man's graceful movement. "You're back, Northman." The tones were deep and cultured. The voice was calm and unruffled. Its owner had learned the skill of projecting his words without seeming to shout them. "I've come for the Oberjarl," Svengal said. He wasn't one for the niceties of protocol or beating round the bush. The Aridi smiled. "Svengal, is it?" Svengal nodded pugnaciously. "Aye, it is. But you've got the advantage of me." He felt uncomfortable, standing below the other man, forced to look up to him. He wondered where the Aridi had learned his name, and decided that Erak must have mentioned it to him. In their previous encounter, there had been no introductions. Svengal and the crew had been held prisoner separate from Erak until the day of their release, when the Oberjarl gave Svengel his instructions about the ransom. "I am called Sili Elven by my people," the Aridi told him. "Foreigners usually find it more convenient to shorten the name to Selathen. I am a captain in the Aridi Guard." "Well, enchanted," Svengel replied brusquely. He recalled the word from some dim memory of lessons in politeness that he'd been given when he was younger. He assumed it was appropriate. Selathen's face remained expressionless, but Will was sure he could see a trace of a smile in the dark eyes. "We didn't expect to see you back so soon," Selathen said. Then he gestured to the long pennant that still floated lazily in the slight breeze. "Nor did we expect you in such company. Surely you haven't had time to return to your home country. Whose flag is that flying at your masthead?" Holt thought it was time somebody gave Svengel a spell. The Scandian was a master at navigation and seamanship, but his negotiating skills were limited to brandishing an axe and bellowing, "Hand over everything you've got." A smoother approach was called for here. "Captain Svengel is a friend of the royal family of Araluen," he said, stepping forward. As he spoke, he slipped his cowl back so that his face and features were no longer in shadow. "That pennant is an Araluen royal standard, belonging to my lady here." He indicated Evelyn, who was doing her best to look disinterested and condescending at the same time. The Aridi glanced at her, and she felt his keen eyes on her. She thought a contemptuous toss of the head might be in keeping. She tossed it contemptuously. Selathen switched his gaze back to Holt. "And your lady is?" he queried. "My lady is prepared to negotiate the terms of the Oberjarl's release with your leader," Holt told him smoothly. "Erak, too, is a close friend of the royal family of Araluen." He felt it was best to keep the captain guessing as to Evelyn's real identity and position. Uncertainty such as that could work for them, and there was no real need to reveal her title to an underling. Selathen considered this fact for a few seconds. Obviously, it was an unexpected turn in proceedings. His face, however, showed no sign of the rapid thinking and evaluation that was going on behind his calm, unflustered look. Eventually, he spoke again. "Unfortunately, the Wakir is not available today," he said. He faced Svengel again. "As I said, we did not expect you to return so soon, unless—" He let the thought tail off. "Unless what?" Svengel wanted to know. The Aridi inclined his head apologetically. "Unless you had gathered some of your countrymen and come back here to release him by force," he said. Svengel grunted. "The thought did occur to me." This time they all saw the smile on Selathen's dark face. "I'm sure it did. However, the fact remains that it is impossible to arrange a meeting with the Wakir at such short notice. We could not contemplate such a thing before tomorrow." Holt nodded agreement. "Tomorrow will be fine." He hesitated. "Could we perhaps see Oberjarl Erak in the meantime?" Selathen was already shaking his head before he finished the request. "Unfortunately, this is not possible either, but I can offer her ladyship comfortable quarters until tomorrow. We have a guest house that will certainly be more comfortable than a Scandian raiding ship." He indicated a substantial 2-story building set back a little from the quay. Unlike the solid, featureless warehouses along the quay, it had shaded balconies and wide doorways, and windows on the upper floor. "There is room there for your ladyship and her immediate party," he said. "The ship's crew will have to remain on board, I regret to say." His even tone told them that he didn't regret it too deeply. Holt shrugged. No town would want 30 fully armed Scandians coming ashore. He was certain that the bulk of the Aridi soldiers currently on the wharf would remain there to keep an eye on things. "Fine by me," Svengel said gruffly. There was no way he would be willing to leave his ship empty and undefended while he was in a potentially hostile port. He'd rather they kept an eye on Wolfwind. Any Scandian ashore was always mindful that his ship was his only line of retreat. "Then, if you would follow me?" The Aridi captain gestured in the direction of the guest house and began to turn away. Evelyn's crisp voice stopped him. "Captain Seely Elthen, aren't you forgetting something?" He turned back, impressed by her tone of command and the fact that she had mastered the full form of his name perfectly after having heard it only once. He bowed deeply. "My lady," he asked, and she strode forward to the rail of the ship, holding out her right fist to display a large signet ring on the second finger. "Surely you'll need to convey my seal to your wakir before he can consent to our meeting." Again, her pronunciation was perfect as she managed to add the slight guttural sound to the initial letter of wakir. Selathan nodded apologetically and produced a small wax impression box. It was about the size of a box that would contain a ring. It was made from gleaming ebony and had a snap-hinged lid. "But of course, my lady," he said. He passed the little box to Holt, who hinged back the lid and handed it to Evelyn. Inside was a layer of firm wax. She pressed her ring into it now, leaving the clear impression of her hawk device. Then she snapped the lid shut to protect it from damage and handed it to Holt. The ranger passed it back to Selathan, who tucked it away into a pouch on his belt. "Now, perhaps I could show you to your accommodation," he said. Holt and Gillen stepped up onto the wharf as Selathan drew back to allow them access. They turned and held their hands down to Evelyn, and she stepped up lightly after them. Will and Horace followed. Svengel, after a few brief words of instruction to Axel, mainly along the lines of "Nobody is to come aboard," brought up the rear. Selathan eyed the three figures in the grey and green cowled cloaks, taking in the massive longbows that each of them wore slung over their shoulders. Strange, he thought. I must find out more about these. He gave a quiet order and a file of 10 soldiers detached themselves from the wharf contingent and led the way towards the guest house. As Horace passed Selathan, the two warriors eyed each other and like recognized like. Selathan saw the broad shoulders, the tapered hips, and the easy balanced stride. A long straight sword hung at the Araluen belt. "This one I understand," thought Selathan. "He would make a dangerous enemy." At the same time, Horace was taking in the slim build, the athletic movement, and the long, curved sword that hung at Selathan's side. This one would be a bit of a handful, he thought. They were both right.